smaller print are actually our forefathers that started this whole thing almost 300 years ago. And so I want to tell you a little bit about this in as short a time as I can. I would tell you that I spent probably hours and hours and hours reading Uncle Russell's notes and then trying to condense this into something that would be short enough, but at least for you to follow the line and know a little bit about your ancestors. So, now that I haven't even looked at my notes, I've already passed some of the stuff up. But anyway, you know, Uncle Russell urged all of us as parents to write down each of our family's history so that generations to come, in Uncle Russell's words, will rise up and call us blessed. That's out of his notes. Anyway, according to the genealogist, we find that the Hoys originally came from the Hoy Island off the north coast of Scotland, which I will say that Judy is the only one that's been there, and which she talked to us a number of years ago about her travels there, which was really wonderful to hear that. But in Russell's notes, he said, therefore we are Scottish. But I have a friend who is Scottish, and he said, you're a Scot, not Scottish. So the history is that they migrated to Germany and settled in the northwest corner of Germany near Holland. And now, as you refer to the chart there, the first person at the top is John Carl Hoy, who came to the United States on a ship by the name of the Loyal Judith in 1739. He was born in 1703 or 04. Anyway, apparently went back to Germany and came back again in 1751. And Uncle Russell had verified this by receiving information from a cousin that showed that the signatures on the logs of both of these trips looked very similar. So we'll assume it's the same John Carl. Anyway, the next name on there is Philip. We'll call him Philip Sr. or Philip the First. He was born in Germany, and he was the second son of John Carl. And there was only one sister in the family. Her name was Mary, but she was born in Pennsylvania. We don't really know about the rest of the children, so we're going to concentrate on Philip Sr. As I said, he was born in Pennsylvania, and he had 6 children, and he traveled across Pennsylvania, and I had trouble finding this, a place called Buffalo Valley. So I spent some time on the Pennsylvania map and finally narrowed it down that it's about south of Lewisburg, which is in the south central part of Pennsylvania. Philip had 2 sons named Philip Penn, who's our descendant, and Daniel. These 2 boys married this is an interesting story. These 2 boys married 2 sisters by the name of Elizabeth and Magdalene Eyre, E-Y-E-R. And they were daughters of Abraham Eyre, who was one of the founders of the newly formed Evangelical Church in the United States, which was led by Jacob Albright. Eventually, Philip Sr. sold his farm and moved the sons to Bloom Township, Fairfield County, Ohio, which is about 30 miles southeast of Columbus. And he was 61 at that time, but he only lived 3 years after that to age 66. William Penn Hoy, which is the son, was born in 1770, died in 1823, and I've just mentioned that Daniel was born in 79 and died in 1870. They moved their families into southeast Ohio in Fairfield County near Lithopolis, Ohio. It's a name you don't hear very often. Anyway, it was there that the brothers started the Evangelical Church in 1817 in Ohio. So if you think about this, we have relatives that really started the church in Ohio. It was originally known as the Bloom Chapel because it was in Bloom Township. But over the years, because the Hoys were leading figures in the church community, it was named the Hoy Memorial Church as it's known today. Uncle Russell preached there on their 50th anniversary after the memorial name was changed. This was a note that I thought is important, particularly as what we're going through now with the Methodist Church situation. A little bit of history.
I drove past that church like 2 years ago, outside of our office. It still says it out front.
And you didn't stop in.
I did. Did you take a picture? I was late for my appointment. I did take a picture of it.
Well, that's great to know, because I always told Rick we needed to take a road trip. And we haven't done it. Maybe Rob and I'll do it. We'll see. Anyway, this is an important note that Uncle Russell made sure that we understand about this. So, the Evangelical Church is there. In 1946, the Evangelical Church, which was started by Jacob Albright, merged with the United Brethren, which was started by Philip Otterbein, to become the EUB. And then later in 1968 in Dallas, Texas, Uncle Russell was present, because I have seen a picture of him in the audience. The Methodist Church, which was started by Francis Asbury, and the EUB merged to become the United Methodist Church as it is today. So that's a little bit of history of how these three churches started, formed, and merged. Anyway, I would just mention about Daniel because he was a very close brother to Philip. He stayed in Fairfield County and lived until he was age 91. And our descendant, Philip Penn Hoy, then left and settled in Hancock County, which is in western Ohio near Findlay. Both Philip and Daniel's children then began to migrate and settle in other parts of Ohio, and the next generation went on to hit homestead in western states like Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, and the Dakotas. And Rick and I talked about this because he's had a communication with a couple of Hoys in Nebraska and Kansas. Anyway, an interesting thing, because of this migration that took place way back then, most of these Hoys probably were related to. Anyway, so Philip II, we will call him, and Elizabeth, his wife, had one son, Abraham, which would be the fourth one on that chart. Abraham was born in 1803, died in 1881. The thing I noticed about most of these Hoys, they had pretty long lives for that time of this, for time in history. Abraham was married in Fairfield County and moved to Hancock County near Findlay. Abraham and wife Polly had 11 children. Alexander was the sixth child. Polly died at 47, and Abraham remarried Rachel, who was age 36, and they had 3 more children. Wow. Abraham was very fruitful, or there may be some other word there. That's a total of 14. So you see, the Hoys kind of spread. Anyway, Abraham settled on a farm near Huffstown in Hancock County. His younger brother was Jacob, who was the father of William Ellsworth Dummy Hoy, who was a famous baseball player who we learned about several years ago thanks to David. Next came Alexander Hoy, 1844-1923. Alex, as he liked to call himself, was married to Callista Jane Orwick and settled in Shelby County, Illinois. That was a little bit south of where his other 2 brothers had settled. Shortly after the death of his first child, they packed up and went to Phillips County, Kansas, and homesteaded on a quarter, which is about 160 acres. The property was right on the border of Kansas and Nebraska, so they never knew which state they lived in. It was there that Elmer Franklin, we keep calling him Frank, but he really was a Franklin. So anyway, that's where Elmer Franklin, 1873, and Jacob Halston, 1874, were born. The reason I mentioned Jacob Halston because Uncle Russell talked about him all the time. Anyway, They were born in a sod house on the prairie. Now, can you imagine that? You know what that really means? Sod house. It was a sod roof. So in order to keep the weather and the rain out, they would excavate sod off the ground, which was probably a lot of straw weed, and that became their roof. Can you imagine that? I bet it dripped a lot. Anyway, my father, and I'm changing this a little bit, my father related two stories which his grandfather had told him. This is kind of interesting for you young folks. A small hunting party of Indians would often stop by and beg for food. One day during an ox roast, I can't believe they had an ox roast back then, a party of Indians were given some meat, and the word got around the Indians, and another party stopped. They asked, they stopped to ask for food. And so the Hoys asked, why don't you hunt buffalo for food? And they replied that the Sioux Indians were their enemies and stood between them and the buffalo. So another time, the Indians, seeing the rain barrel, which is how they collected water back then, and thinking it contained whiskey, said, me swap calico beer, pointing to the barrel. Well, they became so insistent, our great-grandmother had to go inside and bolt the door. Yep. Well, after a year of grasshoppers and another year of drought, my great-grandparents sold 160 acres February 16, 1875, and moved back to Shelby County, Illinois. My grandfather, Frank Lund, was only 2 years old. His brother Halston was only 7 months. My great-grandmother had not been well, and so my grandparents wanted them to move back to civilized country. Great-grandmother Callista died February 17, 1880, the victim of loneliness, homesickness, and having borne 6 children in 8 years. Yeah. After great-grandmother Callista's death, Alex brought the remaining 4 children back to Hancock County, Ohio, where they were placed in homes, which I didn't know this, with grandparents, uncles, and aunts for some time. Sometime later, Alex remarried a widow by the name of Sabina Pontius, which some of you will remember that name. They had 1 child. Her name was Lucy. And Lucy was a school teacher. She died at 28 of tuberculosis. 5 years ago, 7 years ago, Nancy and I decided to go on a road trip, and so we visited her grave in Spring Grove Cemetery, along with our grandparents, Frank and Jesse, and great-grandparents, Alex and Sabina. And I took pictures of them and showed them at a past reunion. Then we're getting into Elmer Franklin Hoy, born February 1st, 1873, died June 25th, 1942. Interesting, Jessie Bell Garman Hoy, his second wife, was born February 11th, 1873, died April 30th, 1946. They were born only 10 days apart, which I found was interesting. But Grandpa Elmer Frank married a woman by the name of Anna Anderson in 1896. In 1897, she died in childbirth along with her child, Mabel. Interesting. Later, Frank married my grandmother, Jessie Bell Garman, in April 1902. They became parents of Russell Hoy, 1904, Robert Garman, 1906, Ross Franklin, 1912. Our grandmother Hoy had 3 sisters, Bertha, Harriet, and Elsie, which most of my generation would remember Aunt Elsie. She was a trip, among other things. Anyway, Aunt Elsie had a cottage up at Lakeside. And often, I imagine most of my generation have been there, and that still stands today on the corner of Peach and 2nd Street. Is that right, Judy? Not a very big place, but probably whoever owns it can get $250,000 for it, no problem. Location. Yeah.
Let's all put our money in.
Yeah, we could pull that.
How many bedrooms?
Well, anyway. In 1908, our grandparents bought a farm a mile away from where the oldest two boys were born. In the fall of 1911, Russell and Robert started school in a one-room schoolhouse. That would be our great-grandparents, your my parents. Anyway, in the winter of 1911, 1912, Grandpa Hoy sold the farm, and that spring, Uncle Ross was born. It was a shock to Russell and Robert, as they never suspected their mother was pregnant, and you didn't tell the kids back in those days. In 1912, my grandfather Alex sold the farm in Hancock County and bought a 180-acre farm in Trumbull County because he was told it was good farmland. The land is on the south side of Bristol Town Line Road between Corey Hunt and Bull Run, is now known as Oak Hill. He paid $30 an acre for this, and now probably worth a couple million as it's totally developed, and I've been by it a lot of times. I don't know how many houses are on that stretch, a lot. Years ago, I think David and Rick and I, with our fathers, took a road trip up to Bristol, and I think they showed us that. I'm not sure if Jim was there or not. But anyway, it was probably around the reunion. Anyway, in March of 1913, with the help of the neighbors, they loaded 3 horses, 5 cows, and some chickens on one boxcar, and machinery and house goods on another, and headed to Warren, Ohio. New neighbors in Bristol met them at the train station with wagons and helped them move into their new home. They lived there for 6.5 years until 1919, and then they moved to a house on Route 88 about a quarter mile east of the Bristol Methodist Church. This house had a cistern and a pump that provided water to the kitchen sink, and they thought they were living in luxury. Grandpa Frank Hoy was very involved with the Methodist Church, where he was the superintendent of Sunday school for 15 years, and where he helped start the Upward League, which later on Russell became the president of. Farming was not an easy life for Grandpa Hoy. Lungs took the brunt of it, and he became ill and bedridden for several years, as there was no antibiotics back then. One day, Grandpa Hoy called his 3 boys into the sick room and told them that he wanted them to grow up to be good Christians and help take care of their mother. Russell said that it was a very teary scene, which made a deep impression on all 3 of the boys. He did eventually get better, about Grandpa Hoy, and started a new occupation as a mail carrier until he couldn't work anymore. I'm going to go fast forward now. Frank Hoy and great-grandpa Alex had passed away. Russell and Ross both went off to college, got married, started their families, and left my dad Robert to care for Grandma Jessie. And this is a little personal thing for me. A young girl by the name of Lucille Dunlap would visit her aunts across the street, and my dad had an eye on her. Well, a few years later, that short distance became very closer, and they were married in the front room of my Aunt Mellie Mahan's house by Reverend Russell Hoy. Go figure that. In 1946, my dad and Grandma Jessie sold the house to a family by the name of Calladine and moved to Warren. That house still stands today, and another Calladine family lives there still. I know this is a lot of history, but it's condensed from a wonderful research that Uncle Russell did, spending more than 30 years. He believed it was important to the generations that followed him and his brothers, Robert and Ross. This would be important. So if you would like to read the full version of his research and notes, ask your parents, they should have a copy. It's nearly 100 pages. Wow. So that's the rest of the story.
and he was in a care center in Columbus for 7 years. That young man right there visited him a lot, and they talked about this history. So he just fulfilled a promise.
Yay, good job, Dave.